Welcome back. You're probably thinking to yourself, another video I have to watch. I know. Rise of Stella, new book. Check it out on Amazon. I'll put the link below. Promoting my book. Just want to be famous. Author, you guys. Just want to do this for a living. Okay, so chapter 3. How long is that? Didn't even look. It's probably really, really long. $16 pages. We can do this. I don't think it's that bad. We'll be all right. So chapter 3. Oh yeah, and I recorded this right after chapter 2, so that's why I look the same, because nothing's changed. Stella had not known how long she had been crawling through the shoot. That's chapter 3. Sorry, spoilers. We're on chapter 2. Chapter 2. Okay, so chapter 2, oh god. Don't even worry about it. We'll get through it. Chapter 2. Liza fell asleep with ease. She slept peacefully and her dreams were consumed with happiness. She admired herself in the mirror, while the people chanted her name behind the castle walls. She greeted her people outside the castle. They fell on their knees for her. She was placed on a great golden throne carried by her subjects. They threw flower petals at her and screamed praises. She was worshipped like a god. Raylan himself loved her, shining the sun specifically on her. As abruptly as running into a wall, she awoke. Her clothes and bedding were soaked with sweat. She was confused at first. Her dreams were pleasant and gave no cause for night sweats. The sweating made sense when a sudden pain exploded in her abdomen. She cried out, instinctively curled up in a ball. The pain vanished and she uncurled. Liza sat up in her bed, panting and looking around her room. A high-pitched ring assaulted her ears, followed by an intense jaw pain. She winced and tried to stretch out her jaw. Her vision became cloudy and panic struck her. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, moving to the edge of the bedstand. She became lightheaded as she tried to call for help. Her voice failed her. Liza put weight on her legs and a horrid crack escaped her knees. She fell to the floor, causing more cracks to sound from her bones. She tried to cry out, but her voice was lost. Spit and snot covered her face from the pain. She started for the door, crawling like a dying animal, each movement more painful than the last. Her hair came into focus as it swayed across her face from her movements. She stopped moving and grabbed her hair. Her jaw quivered and her eyes widened with horror. Her hair was gray and thin. She grabbed for more and lifeless chunks stuck to her hands. Her hands had aged rapidly and were now thin and wrinkled. Her perfect arms withered in front of her eyes. Tears rolled down her face and she threw her head back, opening her mouth wide to scream. Her body could no longer support her, and she collapsed face first. Her lungs began to struggle. Breaths became shallow and painful. She was dying. Shadows folded in on each other and then expanded. A silhouette of a man appeared standing next to her. Liza could not lift her face to see who it was, but noted the man was barefoot. The shadowy figure squatted beside her. "What are you doing?" Oh. The cigarettes? Yeah, they're right here. There you go. Sorry. So rude. Where was I? I'll just start from the beginning paragraph, sorry. Shadows folded in on each other and then expanded. A silhouette of a man appeared standing next to her. Liza could not lift her face to see who it was, but noted the man was barefoot. The shadowy figure squatted beside her. His face was shrouded. "Little queen." His voice was haunting, but calming. It was layered and contained an echo. It was not natural. Ah, he inhaled deeply. Desperation, fear. There's no smell quite like it. His tone was condescending, as if she were lesser than he. Liza was offended. I am a queen, she thought. He moved hair from her face, which fell to the floor. Ugh, what happened? He was disgusted. Do you think Ray Lynn abandoned you? His tone was full of mockery. Or perhaps you've ran that gift tank empty. He stood and walked around the room, eyeing her belongings. I mean, 100 years is a long time to combat with magic. Although, sadly, I must say for you, at least 200, maybe 3, it's not your best look. He laughed. Who finds amusement at what she endured? Liza wanted to scream and lash out at this intruder, but she could not. I do find this amusing, the man replied to her thought. Liza's eyes widened at this trick. Look at it from my perspective. He came back to her side and squatted. You spend your whole life fighting to stay young and beautiful, but here you are, dying as this grotesque little thing. He laughed dramatically, as if unable to contain it. Liza's breath grew more labored as she crept closer to death. As for who I am, does it matter? Wouldn't you rather know what I'm offering? She could not see through the shroud, but she felt him smiling. You want power, he whispered seductively. You want youth. He leaned into her ear. And beauty. He leaned back and gasped. How could I possibly know all that? He laughed. You're all the same, so predictable and simple. The energy in the room was heavy and nefarious. She did not believe him and did not want his help, but what choice did she have? Yes, it's true. I can give you all these things and more. There is, of course, a price, but I have a feeling you're willing to pay anything. What do you want? Liza thought, at this point knowing the stranger could hear her. Besides being my loyal servant, I want your soul. His voice dropped, almost drooling over the last word. Of course, I would give you time to consider, but we both know you haven't much left. What will it be? Die now or live? I want to live. Liza's heart stopped beating. She laid limply, eyes wide, a rotten corpse. Stella stood in a peaceful meadow with trees surrounding. She walked towards the opposite tree line, eyeing this serene place. Birds chipped and flew overhead. The wind gently whistled through the woods, delivering the sweet scent of wildflowers to her nose. She inhaled it deeply, closing her eyes and basking in the warm glow of the sun. She reached the meadow of the clearing and had just noticed she was barefoot. She spread her toes, smiling as the soft blades of grass tickled them. She had never felt such peace and calm. A dense purple fog rolled towards her direction. Once it reached the meadow, it formed a wall stretching skyward like a tsunami wave. Unnatural shrieks erupted from within. An overwhelming sense of dread fell upon her. She backed away cautiously, but instincts told her to run. She turned around and was stopped in her tracks by a man. We have to go, she said, taking his hand. She wanted to ask what a soldier of the Holy Lands was doing here, but she knew this place was no longer safe. The youth yanked his hand free and opened his mouth wider than humanly possible. Her eyes widened and swelled with tears at the horror. He released an unbearable shriek that caused her to cover her ears. His life quickly faded and he dropped to the ground as a grotesque corpse. What? Stella was in shock, her heart and breathing in panic. Stella turned to run from this horror, only to be greeted by another. The monstrosity had a human face, reptilian black eyes, bat ears and nose, and an oversized mouth with more teeth than she could count. The creature let out a similar shriek to the soldier. She backed away from it, tripping on the corpse. She fell to the ground and landed on her back. The beast descended upon her, Stella covered her face with her hands and screamed. Stella sat up, panting and wiping the sweat from her brow. She caught her breath and looked around her room. The torchlight from the hall entered her room through small cracks in her door, causing furniture to cast unsettling shadows. She threw the blankets off and sat at the edge of the bed, regaining her calm. She rubbed her bloodshot eyes that begged for sleep. She had not gotten a decent sleep for a while and was growing accustomed to being tired. She rose to her feet and walked to a small wooden table aside her dresser. Stella poured a cup of water from the pitcher that stood on the table and looked at herself in the mirror. Black bags hung under her eyes and her face was more pale than normal. She sighed and drank. She studied her reflection that became more difficult to see as the mirror fogged. "What?" Stella asked, leaning towards the mirror. Her breath was visible, something that was not possible in the Holy Lands due to the constant sun. The mirror was now fully fogged over. Letters began to form as if someone was writing on the mirror with a finger. D-A-N-G-E-R. Stella's heart raced. From what? She asked herself, but the mirror responded. E-V-E-R-Y-O-N-E. She was certain she was still dreaming and stepped back from the mirror. She paced back and forth, mumbling, "Wake up." The tip of her nose felt cold, and her certainty faded. She glanced back at the mirror that was now fogged again. She stared at it for a minute, but nothing happened. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. R-U-N. The word was written repeatedly, overlapping itself as it refogged. A faint whisper hummed in the air around her. "Now!" the whisper suddenly shouted, and at the same moment, her bedroom door flew open and slammed hard against the wall. Stella jumped and ran out of the room. She feared what would happen if she failed to comply. Most of the castle still slept, save the occasional patrolling guards. She knew their usual routes. Stella often explored the castle as a youth, and by trial and error learned how to avoid guards. She could run to her mother. Surely she would know what to do, she thought as she ran, but she second-guessed herself. Her mother would most likely be furious and lecture her. She did not know what to do but run. Stella had reached the storage rooms and remembered a passageway out of the castle. She fully explored them as a girl. They had not been utilized to her knowledge, but put in place as an insurance policy if a rebellion were to rise. She closed the door behind her and listened. No one was near. Stella looked around the room to find the hidden door. So much had changed, and her time as a curious youth felt like a lifetime ago. She closed her eyes and concentrated on the memory. It was on the right wall, she thought. She leaned against a wooden shelf holding grain bags and barrels of wine. She pushed using all her weight, and the shelf slid across the stone floor. A small wooden door was revealed at the base of the wall behind the shelf. It was about half the size of a regular door, and it had no handle. Stella knelt beside it and placed her fingernails in the outline of the door. She pried it open. Dust flew wildly as it opened, evidence that it had not been used. She peeked inside, swiping at the visible cobwebs. It was completely dark. She studied the room and spotted long wax candles standing on a shelf opposite from her. She grabbed one and held it to the torch that lit the storage room, igniting the wick. Stella placed the candle in the passage and climbed in after it. She slammed the small door shut again using a rope attached to the inside. Stella froze as the storage door opened and closed. She held her breath and pushed the candle further in to avoid being seen. A male sighed and pushed the shelf back to its proper place with a grunt. The storage door opened and closed again. He was gone. She released her breath. "What am I doing?" she whispered. She was acting like a fugitive in her own home. The adrenaline began to wear off and a more level-headed Stella emerged. Perhaps her mother had been right to treat her as a child. She pushed on the door to return to the storage room, but it would not budge. The heavy shelf held the door tightly shut. She now had no choice but to maneuver through the passageways. She grabbed her candle and crawled forward. It was dark, cold, and quiet, an eternal emptiness, except in this moment, the sound of a fingernail scratching wood broke through. The sound guided her like the light at the end of a dark tunnel. Liza slowly blinked her eyes open, regaining consciousness. "Oh, good, you're back." "What?" Liza sat up and looked towards the voice. "I was getting bored. You sure took your time, but I suppose these things can't be rushed." A handsome man sat in her corner chair, his fingernail scraping up and down its wood arm. He had sharp black eyes, though off-putting, beautiful. His hair was black and short, and his skin was pale. Liza met many before, but none like this. She felt drawn to him, almost in awe of him. Everything that happened suddenly rushed to her memory. The contract. The man burst into laughter. "I was just having a bit of fun. You should have seen the way you panicked trying to sign your name before your last breath." He continued to laugh briefly and then sighed as it subsided. "Priceless. So I'm alive?" Liza's head throbbed and her throat felt tight. Her sight, hearing, and thoughts were all dulled. "Well," he replied hesitantly, pondering the best way to answer, "more or less." He paused and tilted his head to one side with a grin. "Less, actually." Liza stared at him blankly with confusion. The man let out a dramatic sigh and rubbed his forehead. "It is very complicated, and tiny human brains cannot handle the details. Trust me, I have tried." He looked at her. "Their brains just kind of liquefy? Anyway, after that happens, they're useless. I mean, they can't even talk." He chuckled. "I sometimes keep them as pets, though." His thoughts went elsewhere as he grew bored of the conversation. He stared off into space. Liza continued to stare at him. She had many questions, but the man's answers left her with more questions. He met her eyes and sighed. "The simplest way to put it is those sparks you carry inside are gone. They are now mine, but your physical self remains. You're welcome, by the way." "Well, that is quite a bit to process," she stammered, investigating her surroundings. Her sight was still blurred, and she blinked violently to try and correct it. "Who?" "My name is Glim, the god of death and other things." "Glim?" Liza was shocked. She knew he was no ordinary man, but would have not guessed she was in the presence of a god. "Not the best name, I'll give you that, but it's what the humans have chosen." Glim rolled his eyes. Liza struggled to her feet, unable to shift her gaze from him. She limped to the mirror, carefully watching Glim as he followed. A look of horror was plastered across her features. Tears pooled as she poked at her face. "You really are hideous, both inside and out." Glim studied her reflection beside her, clearly disgusted. He rested his head on his shoulders. "Do not worry, I cannot leave you like this. What good would that do for me?" "No. You would be beaten, or worse, I fear." The pair made eye contact through the reflections. Glim's grin faded and his humorous attitude evaporated instantly. "I just want you to remember this. Remember what you are without me." Silence lingered as his words were burned into Liza's brain. She looked over herself. Chunks of her hair were missing, and the pieces that remained were gray and as fragile looking as glass. Her skin was loose and hung from her bones as if trying to separate itself. She could never forget this atrocious creature she beheld. She thought about the pain she endured from dying and the void that greeted her after. Those things seemed more tolerable than living it as an abomination. This is what she truly was, both in and out. For the first time in her life, she felt regret. Regret for her callousness. She fell short as a mother, a wife, and a queen. She deserved death. Do not despair. Look what you become when you serve a true God. Glim smiled and lifted his head from her shoulder. He pursed his lips and lightly blew on the mirror. A purple fog covered the mirror and her. A gentle warming sensation washed over her. Her body soaked up the fog like a dry sponge. Liza got drunk on it as she breathed it in. Power coursed through her veins. The shadows dissipated, revealing her new reflection. Immediately upon seeing herself, the regret she had felt moments prior disappeared, overshadowed by the beauty before her and the power she felt. Her hair was now black, shiny, and looked like silk. Her eyes were black like Glim's, and her skin pale, but soft and held tightly to her figure. The youthfulness she fought to preserve was now achieved. Her facial features and shape remained, still recognizable as the queen, but younger and more striking. You clean up nice, Glim amusingly jabbed. Liza giggled and turned to him, his amusement at her expense suddenly now more charming. He was abnormally attractive before her transformation, but now her heart burned with desire for him. She pictured herself at his side as his queen. Now, I want something from you. Glim offered open hands to her, and she took them, standing in front of him. Name it, and it's yours, my king. She spoke with an eagerness to please. I want her. He grinned, displaying his perfect teeth and pointing at a portrait on her wall. Her? She asked, cringing. She's nothing. What could you possibly want from her? Liza laughed. I'm not sure what it is yet, but I plan to find out. Glim spoke nefariously, a weight behind his words she could not place. Liza wanted to press him for more information, but refrained from it. While his humor portrayed a sense of openness, he was still a god, and she feared angering him. As you wish. Alright, that was chapter 2. And next time we'll do chapter 3. Thanks.